Most people think Cambodia is poor because it failed, because it lacked resources, because it was unlucky, because it was always behind. But that story is comforting and completely wrong. Because Cambodia wasn't always poor. At one point, it was one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, with cities, engineering, and systems that even modern nations struggle to replicate. And then something unprecedented happened. Cambodia didn't slowly decline. It didn't lose a war, it didn't run out of money, it rejected wealth itself. Money was abolished, cities were emptied, education was erased, and an entire nation was forced back to zero, not by invasion but by ideology. This video is not about why Cambodia is poor. It's about why Cambodia chose poverty over prosperity and how that single decision still shapes its future today. And by the end of this video, you'll see Cambodia not as a failed country, but as one of the most misunderstood nations in Southeast Asia. When we talk about poor countries, we usually tell ourselves a simple story. They were always poor, they never had the right resources, they just couldn't catch up. And Cambodia fits perfectly into that mental shortcut. A developing country, low income, a tragic past, case closed. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. Cambodia didn't fail. It was deliberately reset. This is where this story breaks, because poverty is often explained as absence. Absence of money, absence of education, absence of opportunity. But Cambodia's poverty didn't come from absence. It came from erasure. And to understand that, we need to kill the first lie we are told about Cambodia, that it was always struggling. Look at Cambodia today and it's easy to believe that lie. Crowded streets in Phnom Penh, low wages, a country still labeled as developing. But that image is not history, it's the aftermath. Cut the camera hard away from modern Cambodia and go back in time. Before Europe mattered here, before modern borders, before GDP rankings even existed. Because centuries ago, Cambodia wasn't on the margins of Asia, it was at the center of it. At a time when much of the world was still figuring out basic governance, Cambodia was building one of the most sophisticated urban systems humanity had ever seen. Not villages, not towns, mega cities. With water management so advanced that modern engineers still study it today. With agriculture so productive it fed hundreds of thousands of people sustainably. With architecture so precise it has survived for nearly 1,000 years. Angkor Wat wasn't a religious monument built by a poor society. It was a statement of power. A signal that this land wasn't struggling to survive. It was confident, organized, and wealthy in ways money alone can't measure. And Cambodia wasn't isolated. It sat directly on ancient trade routes linking India, China, and Southeast Asia. Ideas, goods, and influence flowed through this region. In other words, Cambodia didn't lack opportunity. It had everything a civilization needs to thrive. Which brings us to the real mystery. If Cambodia once had systems, stability, food security, engineering, and influence, then poverty wasn't inevitable. It wasn't fake, it wasn't geography, and it definitely wasn't because Cambodians were incapable. So what happened? How does a civilization that once mastered water, land, and people end up erased from the economic map? That question matters because Cambodia's poverty isn't the result of failure, it's the result of a decision. And to understand that decision, we need to go back to a time when money wasn't the problem at all. To understand how deep Cambodia's fall was, we first need to understand how high it once stood. Because long before poverty became part of its identity, Cambodia was wealthy in ways most modern countries still struggle to achieve. Not in cash, not in currency, but in systems. At its peak, the Khmer Empire was one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. This wasn't a small regional kingdom quietly surviving on the edge of history. It was a dominant force across Southeast Asia, stretching across modern-day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And at the heart of this empire stood Angkor, not just a city but an engineered landscape. Angkor was built around a simple but revolutionary idea: control water and you control civilization. The Khmer didn't wait for rain. They didn't fear droughts or floods. They designed one of the largest and most sophisticated hydraulic systems the pre-industrial world had ever seen. Massive reservoirs, canals stretching for kilometers, perfectly timed water flows that fed rice fields year-round. This wasn't survival agriculture. This was abundance by design. While many societies lived harvest to harvest, Angkor produced food surpluses so large that hundreds of thousands of people could live, work, build, and specialize without worrying about starvation. That's real wealth. Because when people aren't busy trying to survive, they innovate. Engineers refined the water systems. Architects built monuments that still defy explanation. Administrators governed complex populations across vast territory. Angkor Wat itself wasn't just a religious structure. It was proof that Cambodia had skilled labor, organizational capacity, long-term planning, political stability. You don't build something like Angkor Wat by accident. You build it when a society is confident in its future. And Cambodia wasn't isolated. It sat at the crossroads of Asia. Trade routes passed through its territory, linking India and China, two of the world's greatest civilizations. Ideas flowed in, influence flowed out. Before Europe even understood the region, Cambodia was already a regional superpower. This is the part of the story that changes everything. Because wealth doesn't begin with GDP numbers or stock markets. It begins with systems that work, institutions that endure, and stability that compounds over generations. By that definition, ancient Cambodia wasn't developing. It was advanced, which makes what comes next impossible to ignore, because civilizations with systems like this don't simply disappear. They don't forget how to farm. They don't forget how to govern. They don't forget how to build, unless something forces them to. And then Cambodia didn't lose its wealth. It rejected it. Civilizations usually collapse slowly, through bad policies, through wars, through decay over generations. Cambodia didn't collapse like that. It collapsed overnight. In the 1970s, Cambodia didn't just change governments, it changed its entire definition of civilization. A radical ideology took control of the country, built on a dangerous belief that modern life itself was the enemy. Cities were seen as corruption, education as betrayal, money as poison, trade as exploitation. And so Cambodia did something no modern nation had ever attempted. It tried to erase itself. Within days, cities were emptied. Phnom Penh, once alive with markets, schools, and hospitals, was forced silent. Millions were marched into the countryside. Doctors became farmers, teachers became laborers, children became tools of the state. Money was abolished, markets were banned, private property was erased. The goal wasn't reform, the goal was reset. A return to a mythical past where everyone was equal, rural, obedient, and poor, because poverty was seen as purity. This is the part most people misunderstand. Cambodia didn't become poor because it lacked resources. It became poor because wealth was declared a crime. Knowledge was dangerous. Foreign influence was treason. Anyone connected to the old systems, engineers, administrators, scholars, became a threat. And so they were removed, not just from their jobs, from society, from history. In just a few years, Cambodia lost the very people who made civilization possible. The people who knew how to run institutions, manage water systems, organize production, educate the next generation. This wasn't economic mismanagement, it was civilizational self-destruction. When money disappears, economies can recover. When buildings fall, they can be rebuilt. But when human capital is erased, the damage lasts for generations. By the time this experiment collapsed, Cambodia wasn't just poorer, it was hollowed out. The systems that once made Angkor possible were gone. The institutional memory was gone. The confidence of a civilization was gone. And when the world finally returned to Cambodia, there was no foundation left to stand on. Other countries in the region modernized, they industrialized, they globalized. Cambodia had to start from zero. Not because it was defeated by an outside power, but because it dismantled itself from within. This is why Cambodia's poverty feels different. It isn't the poverty of neglect, It's the poverty of interruption. A civilization paused, then restarted without its builders. And that pause would cast a shadow far longer than anyone imagined. When Cambodia's nightmare ended, the obvious question was simple. Why didn't it recover like everyone else? Vietnam fought wars and still grew. China endured chaos and still industrialized. Even countries poorer than Cambodia found a way forward. So why did Cambodia fall behind for so long? The answer isn't money, it's missing people. When rebuilding begins after conflict, nations usually rely on something invisible but essential: human capital. Teachers to educate, engineers to design, administrators to organize, entrepreneurs to take risks. Cambodia didn't have that luxury because the previous decades didn't just damage the economy, they removed an entire generation of knowledge. The educated class was gone, the institutional memory was gone, the people who knew how systems worked were gone. Imagine restarting a country with no instruction manual. Schools reopened, but there were no teachers left to train teachers. Hospitals reopened, but there were few doctors to lead them. Governments existed, but lacked experienced administrators who knew how to govern effectively. Other Southeast Asian nations modernized by upgrading existing systems. Cambodia had to invent everything again. At the same time, the world didn't pause. Globalization accelerated, manufacturing shifted, supply chains hardened around early movers. By the time Cambodia re-entered the global economy, it was late. And lateness in economics compounds. Foreign investors came but cautiously, infrastructure was built but unevenly, growth happened but without depth. And then there was trauma. Economic models don't measure fear, but fear changes behavior. Generations grew up with survival instincts, not entrepreneurial ones. Trust in institutions remained fragile. Risk felt dangerous in a country where systems once turned against their own people. This matters because long-term growth depends on trust. Trust that effort will be rewarded, that property will be protected, that education will matter. Cambodia needed time to rebuild that belief. Meanwhile, its neighbors surged ahead. Thailand leveraged stability. Vietnam leveraged discipline and export-led growth. Malaysia invested heavily in human capital. Cambodia, by contrast, was rebuilding from a deeper hole, one created not by war alone but by systemic erasure. This is why Cambodia's recovery looks slower, more fragile, and more uneven. Not because Cambodians lack ambition, but because ambition needs structure to scale. And here's the tragedy. Cambodia didn't just lose decades of economic output, it lost momentum. Momentum is what turns growth into transformation. Without it, progress feels incremental instead of exponential. But history doesn't end here. Because what Cambodia lost in the past may have quietly created an opening for the future. And that brings us to the final question. Not about what Cambodia lacks, but about what it still has. For most of modern history, Cambodia's story has been told in terms of loss. Lost decades, lost people, lost momentum. But history has the strange habit of looping back. Because what Cambodia lost in the past may have quietly shaped what it can offer in the future. And that thing isn't money. It's potential. Cambodia today is one of the youngest countries in Southeast Asia. A majority of its population was born after the country's darkest period. That matters because young societies don't carry the same institutional inertia. They're more adaptable, more open to change, more willing to plug into new systems. At the same time, Cambodia's location hasn't changed. It still sits between major Asian economies, still close to global shipping routes, still connected to the same geography that once made it powerful. Only now, the world is changing around it. Manufacturing is slowly moving away from China, global supply chains are diversifying, companies are looking for countries that are young, affordable, and strategically placed. Cambodia fits that profile. This doesn't mean it will become rich overnight, but it does mean the rules are shifting, and Cambodia is no longer locked out of the game. Tourism, once a side story, has become a gateway, not just to revenue but to global visibility. Angkor isn't just a historical site, it's a reminder that Cambodia has built great systems before, that complexity is not foreign to this land, that civilization has deep roots here. More importantly, Cambodia has something rare in today's world, a second chance without total collapse. Many countries change only after disaster. Cambodia already lived through one. That experience shapes priorities. Stability is valued, growth is cautious, ideology is treated with suspicion. And that may be Cambodia's quiet advantage, because the future doesn't reward extremism. It rewards countries that can integrate slowly, carefully, and sustainably. Cambodia didn't choose poverty forever. It chose a path that interrupted its natural trajectory. And now, after decades of rebuilding, that trajectory is slowly re-emerging. The lesson of Cambodia isn't that poverty is inevitable, it's that wealth is fragile. It depends on systems, on trust, on people who know how to make societies work. Cambodia once mastered that, then it erased it. Now it's trying to rebuild it piece by piece. And whether Cambodia becomes wealthy again won't be decided by history, but by what it chooses to remember and what it chooses never to repeat. Thanks for watching it, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button.